Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo. Oh. There we go. Okay, hi everyone. Let us continue. So, the third, let's see, I might be repeating some here, but I don't want to miss anything, so apologize if this repetition. It's been a hectic last several days, having the privilege to do ceremonies for a couple of dear friends who've recently passed away. It's kind of taken me off my daily routine, but this is life. Third is the consideration of time. Anyone who hopes to spread the Buddhist teachings must make certain to understand the time. For example, if a farmer were to plant his fields in autumn and winter, then, even though the seeds and the land and the farmer's efforts were the same as ever, this planting would not result in the slightest gain, but would rather end in loss. If the farmer planted one small plot in that way, he would suffer a minor loss, and if he planted acres and acres, he would suffer a major loss. But if he plows and plants in the spring and summer, then, whether the fields are of superior, medium, or inferior quality, each will bring forth its corresponding share of crops. The preaching of the Buddhist teachings is similar to this. If one propagates the teaching without understanding the time, one will reap no benefit, but, on the contrary, what will fall into the evil paths. When Shakyamuni Buddha made his appearance in this world, he was determined to preach the Lotus Sutra, but though the capacities of his listeners may have been right, the proper time had not yet come. Therefore, he spent a period of more than 40 years without preaching the Lotus Sutra, explaining as he has in the Lotus itself that the time to preach so had not yet come. The day after the Buddha's passings begins the 1,000-year period known as the former day of the law, when those who uphold the precepts are many, while those who break them are few. The day after the end of the former day of the law marks the beginning of the 1,000-year period known as the middle day of the law, when those who break the precepts are many, while those without precepts are few. And the day after the end of the middle day of the law begins the 10,000-year period known as the latter day of the law. That's our time. When those who break the precepts are few, while those without precepts are many. During the former day of the law, one should cast aside those who break the precepts or have no precepts at all, giving alms only to those who uphold the precepts. During the middle day of the law, one should cast aside those without precepts and give alms only to those who break them. And during the latter day of the law, one should give alms to those without precepts, treating them in the same way as if they were Buddhas. Now, I want you to understand that paragraph specifically. To those Buddhists or non-Buddhists who continue to carry on this attachment to the monastic ideal, the asceticism of 2,600, 3,000 years ago, this paragraph very specifically calls out the nonsense of that in this day and age. This is no longer the time for those ascetic practices. And make no mistake, when Nichiren talks about the precepts, he is specifically talking about monastic practice. This is what the precepts were all about. The 250 precepts, the 500 precepts, the 100 precepts. In all of its incarnations, the precepts were rules of behavior for monastic monks in the early teachings of Buddhism and in the early days of Buddhism. So he's very clearly saying, during the latter day of the law, one should give alms to those without precepts, because in this latter day, monastic practice is not relevant. It does not produce, it is like a farmer planting seeds in the winter. So I can't make it any more plain than that. However, whether in the former, the middle, or the latter day of the law, one should never in any of these three periods give alms to those who slander the Lotus Sutra, whether they keep the precepts, break the precepts, or do not receive them at all. If alms are given to those who slander the Lotus Sutra, then the land will invariably be visited by the 3 calamities and 7 disasters, and the persons who give such alms will surely fall into the great citadel of the hell of incessant suffering. So, pretty clear admonition. When the votary of the Lotus Sutra denounces the Provisional Sutras, it is like a ruler, a parent, or a teacher disciplining a retainer, a son, or a disciple. But when practitioners of the Provisional Sutras denounce the Lotus Sutra, it is like retainers, sons, or disciples attempting to punish their ruler, parent, or teacher. So here again, and I want to point this up because of recent posts that I've seen online, this adherence to the Lotus Sutra as supreme isn't wrong, but when it is interpreted as meaning that no other sutra is of any consequence, and that all one should study is the Lotus, there's an extreme problem there. Because as you notice, the way he wrote this, if we can believe in word for word these translations, but the meaning is what's important, right? Not the words. He's very clearly saying that when the votary of the Lotus Sutra denounces the Provisional Sutras, he's not saying they don't exist. He's saying that their position in the teachings is not the ultimate. In other words, all of Nichiren's scholarship, his great accomplishment, in my view, not just my view, but I'm the one talking about this now to you, his great accomplishment was to firmly place, and really repeating what Tendai, hundreds of years before him, said, that the Lotus is the ultimate of the Mahayana teachings, of all the teachings. But that doesn't discount that the other teachings have validity. It's just that they're not the ultimate expression of the Dharma. The Lotus Sutra puts the final cap on the whole thing. Right? So, at present, it has been 210 or more years since we entered the latter day of the law. One should consider very carefully whether now is the time best suited for the Provisional Sutras or Nembutsu teachings, or whether it is time when the Lotus Sutra should spread. Now, in that expression is exactly what I'm saying once again. In his day, a lot of people were practicing earlier sutras, in fact, erroneous sutras written by other members, like Honen, who wrote his own versions of sutras and claimed superiority of the Nembutsu, as you will recall, is the chanting of Amida Buddha's name, as the sole practice of Buddhism. Well, if you study anything outside of those specific teachings, that's not supported anywhere. Amida is just a character that was created, like all characters in the hyperbole and storytelling devices of the teaching of Buddhism, to represent a certain idea. That idea isn't that it doesn't have value. It isn't that it is inaccurate. What is inaccurate is to put all your eggs in that basket, because it's only part of the teaching. It's like understanding only addition and subtraction and arithmetic. What do you do when you get to multiplication and division? Well, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't have any place in the world. It doesn't work. What? That's exactly the correlation to what happens with Nembutsu. No. Addition and subtraction is absolutely beneficial and necessary in all of mathematics. But it isn't primary, or primary in the sense that you don't need anything else. It's primary in the sense that it gets you going into the ideas that mathematics explores, but it's far more glorious and amazing than just adding and subtracting. Look at algebra. Look at geometry. The world, we know, works on those principles, and they're not just about addition and subtraction. This is what Nichiren is always talking about. It's not saying the Lotus Sutra is the only thing, the only true Buddhism. What he's doing is he's placing it in the proper context, the proper place of honor, the proper pinnacle of the teachings. But pinnacles are, by definition, things that stand on previous investigation and understanding, right? Otherwise, why would there be a pinnacle? It would just be the thing, right? Fourth is the consideration of the country. One must never fail to take into account the kind of country in which one is spreading the Buddhist teachings. There are cold countries, hot countries, poor countries, rich countries, central countries, and peripheral countries, large countries and small countries, countries wholly given over to thieving, countries wholly given over to the killing of living things, and countries known for their utter lack of filial piety. In addition, there are countries wholly devoted to the Hinayana teachings, countries wholly devoted to the Mahayana teachings, and countries in which both Hinayana and Mahayana are pursued. In the case of Japan, therefore, we must carefully consider whether it is a country suited exclusively to Hinayana, a country suited exclusively to Mahayana, or a country suited for the practice of both Hinayana and Mahayana. Fifth, and he's talking about Japan here, just as a reminder. Fifth is the sequence of propagation. Once again, that validates what I've been saying, that I'm not hearing enough in Buddhist circles. The sequence of propagation. Why would you even bring up the sequence of propagation if the Lotus Sutra was the only thing to follow? It's not that it's the only thing. It is that it is the ultimate thing. Put everything in its proper order, right? You may be able to go to an automobile manufacturing plant and start an engine. But if it isn't connected to a chassis and wheels and controls, you won't get anywhere. There's a proper order. Fifth is the sequence of propagation. In a country where the Buddhist teachings have never been introduced, there, of course, will be none who are familiar with Buddhism. But in a country where Buddhism has already been introduced, there will be those who believe in the Buddhist teachings. Therefore, one must first learn what kind of Buddhist country or doctrines have already spread in a particular country before attempting to propagate Buddhism there. If the Hinayana and provisional Mahayana teachings have already spread, then one should by all means propagate the true Mahayana teaching. But if the true Mahayana teaching has already spread, then one must not propagate the Hinayana or provisional Mahayana teachings. And I say that with force because I'm talking about the country I'm in North America, but this in actuality affects more than 130 countries, 120, 130. Anyway, most of the world today has been exposed to the Lotus Sutra. Whether that sutra has been introduced with the benefit of provisional Mahayana teachings, the Lankavatara, the perfection of wisdom, so on and so forth, or even the Hinayana, that's really kind of irrelevant, only because at this point in our human history, in the 21st century, the Lotus Sutra has spread into all of these countries on top of previous Mahayana and Hinayana teachings. Not all in the same degree, but certainly if the Lotus Sutra has been introduced into the country, then the previous teachings must also, even by reference, be introduced into those same countries. Do you see what I'm saying? Even if calculus reaches a small country in the southern hemisphere, in order for it to be propagated or even slightly understood, then certainly mathematics has to be accounted for, learned. You without basic math and algebraic skills, the calculus could not be propagated. Do you follow? So, if the true Mahayana teachings have already spread, then one must not propagate the Hinayana or the provisional Mahayana teachings. So I have people running around who understand calculus, and I say, hey, sit down, let me teach you this plus minus thing. I'm retarding the country. I mean, by the definition of word, retarding. I'm not trying to make a slanderous comment. One throws aside shards and rubble in order to pick up gold and gems, but one must not throw aside gold and gems in order to pick up shards and rubble. If one takes the 5 principles outlined above into account when propagating the Buddhist teachings, then one can surely become a teacher to the entire nation of Japan. To understand that the Lotus Sutra is the king of sutras, the foremost among them all, is to have a correct understanding of the teachings. Again, he's establishing the order of the teachings, right? Yet, Fao Yun of Kwangche Temple and Hui Quan of Dao Chi Tzu Temple claimed that the Nirvana Sutra is superior to the Lotus Sutra. Cheng Quan of Mount Qingliang and Kobo of Mount Koya claimed that the Flower Garland and the Mahavairochana Sutras are superior to the Lotus Sutra. Chi Tsang of Cha Tsang Tzu Temple and the priest Kui Chi of Tzu En Tzu Temple claimed that the 2 sutras known as the Wisdom and the Profound Secrets are superior to the Lotus Sutra. One man alone, the great teacher Chiche Tendai of Mount Tendai, not only asserted that the Lotus Sutra is superior to all the other sutras, but urged that anyone claiming there is a sutra superior to the Lotus should be admonished. He said that if such persons persist in their false claim, their tongues will surely fester in their mouths during the present existence, and after death they will fall into the Avicii hell. One who is able to distinguish right from wrong among all of these different opinions may be said to have a correct understanding of the teachings. Of all the 1,000 or 10,000 scholars of the present age, surely each and every one is confused as to this point. If so, then there must be very few who have a correct understanding of the teaching. If there are none with a correct understanding of the teaching, there will be none who read the Lotus Sutra. If there are none who read the Lotus Sutra, there will be none who can act as a teacher to the nation. If there is no one to act as a teacher to the nation, then everyone within the nation will be confused as to the distinctions within the body of sutras, such as those between the Hinayana and the Mahayana, the provisional and the true, and the exoteric and the esoteric sutras. Not a single person will be able to escape the sufferings of birth and death. And in the end, they will all become slanderers of the law. Those who, because of slandering the law, fall into the Vichy hell will be more numerous than the dust particles of the land, while those who, by embracing the law, are freed from the sufferings of birth and death will number less than the speck of dirt that can be placed on a fingernail. What a fearful thing is that! During the 400 years or more since the time of Emperor Kalmu, all the people in Japan have had the capacity to attain enlightenment solely through the Lotus Sutra. They are like those persons with capacities suited to the pure and perfect teachings who, for a period of 8 years, listened to the preaching of the Lotus Sutra on Eagle Peak. Confirming of this may be found in the records of the great teacher Tendai, Prince Shotoku, and Reverend Ganjin, the great teacher Kompon, Dengyo, the Reverend Anen, and Eshin. To understand this is to have an understanding of the people's capacity. Yet the Buddhist scholars of our time say that the people of Japan all have capacities fit only for the recitation of Amida Buddha's name, the Nembutsu. They are like Shariputra, in the episode I mentioned earlier, who, because he was misled into the capacity of the persons under his instruction, in the end turned them into Ichantikas. In Japan, at present, some 2,210 years after the passing of the thus come one, Shakyamuni, in the last of the 500-year periods after his passing, the hour has come for the widespread propagation of Myoho-renge Kyo, the flower garland, or the Lotus Flower Sutra. To understand this is to have an understanding of the time. Yet there are Buddhist scholars in Japan today who cast aside the Lotus Sutra and instead devote themselves exclusively to practicing the invocation of Amida Buddha's name. There are others who teach the Hinayana precepts and speak contemptuously of the priests who are ordained with the Mahayana precepts on Mount He, as well as those who present what they describe as a separate transmission outside the sutras, disparaging the correct doctrine of the Lotus Sutra. Such persons may surely be said to misunderstand the time. They are like the monk Superior Intent, who slandered Bodhisattva Root of Joy, or the scholar Gunprabha, who behaved with contempt toward Bodhisattva Maitreya, thus inviting the terrible sufferings of the Avicii hell. Japan is a country related exclusively to the Lotus Sutra, just as the country of the Shravasti in India was related solely to the Mahayana teachings. In India, there were countries that were wholly devoted to Hinayana, those that were wholly devoted to Mahayana, and those that were devoted to both Hinayana and Mahayana teachings. Japan is a country that is exclusively suited to the Mahayana. And among those teachings, it should be dedicated solely to the Lotus Sutra. The above statement is attested to in the treatise on the stages of yoga practice and the writings of Sheng Chao and the records of Prince Shotoku, the great teacher Tengyo, and Anen. To understand this is to understand the country. And I will say to you right now that North America is completely suited only to the essential Mahayana teachings. That doesn't mean you can't study the others, but they should all be studied in order to better understand the essential teachings of the Lotus Sutra. Yet there are Buddhist scholars in our present age who address the people of Japan and instruct them only in the precepts, asceticism, of the Hinayana, or who attempt to make them all into followers of the Nembutsu. This is like placing impure food in a jeweled vessel. This simile of the jeweled vessel is taken from an essay on the protection of the nation by the great teacher Dengyo. In Japan, during the 240 or more years from the time when Buddhism was first introduced from the Korean kingdom of Pache, I may not be saying that right, in the reign of Emperor Kimei to the reign of Emperor Kamu, only the Hinayana and Provisional Mahayana teachings were propagated throughout the country. Though the Lotus Sutra existed in Japan, its significance had not yet been made clear. This was similar to the situations before in China, where the Lotus Sutra had existed for more than 300 years before its significance was clarified. And I think I'm trying to keep these videos shorter for you. And we covered a lot of ground. So we'll continue in the next video with the teaching, the capacity, and the time. It's an interesting go-show. And reinforces Nichiren's place in all of the scholarship of Buddhism. And I thank you for listening. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Have a great, great day. And